a black businesswoman, after years of relentless work and sacrifice, finally returned to her private jet after an exhausting business trip. She was looking forward to a quiet, peaceful flight back home, but as she approached the entrance to the jet, everything changed. A white flight crew member, without cause or reason, blocked her path and accused her of being in the wrong place. He humiliated her in front of everyone, questioning her ability to even belong on the jet. What happened next shocked everyone, and it was a moment that would change the dynamics of the entire industry. Just moments later, she made a decision that no one saw coming. A move that would set off a series of events that no one could have predicted. Stay with me. This is a story that must be told. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us where you're watching from today. If you find this story eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories like this. It started as just another ordinary day. The glass doors of the private terminal parted with a hush, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile veneer of exclusivity that hung over the place like a curtain drawn too tight. Dr. Maya Blake stepped inside, the soft click of her heels swallowed by the polished marble floor. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had long learned the value of silence in rooms that questioned her right to exist within them. The terminal was a sanctuary for those who moved through the world insulated by wealth. But even wealth, Maya knew, was no shield against the kind of gaze that measured you, weighed you, and found you lacking. She felt it before it was spoken. A flicker of eyes too quick to be casual. A ripple of hesitation in a practiced smile. At the counter, the attendant's tone was polite but distant, her eyes flickering to the black woman standing before her. Good morning. May I have your name and flight details? Maya Blake. I'm taking the private jet to Chicago. The attendant's fingers danced across the keyboard. There was a pause. Brief, but long enough to be telling. Yes, Dr. Blake. You're confirmed. The jet will be ready shortly. You can wait in the lounge. Or I can escort you now. Maya nodded, offering a restrained smile. I'll head to the jet. As she walked, the subtle shift of eyes followed her. The same eyes that assumed the polished black town car she stepped out of earlier belonged to someone else. Chauffeur, assistant, anyone but her. The jet sat waiting at Gate 5, its sleek frame catching the mid-morning sun. Maya approached the aircraft, catching sight of a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing near the entrance. Captain Peter Mason. His posture was straight, rigid as stone. He did not smile as she approached. Can I help you, ma'am? His voice was flat, his eyes heavy with the same weight Maya had carried all her life. I'm here for the flight to Chicago. He glanced at the black suitcase trailing behind her, the neatly tailored lines of her blazer. And yet something in his gaze tightened. This is a private flight, he said slowly, as though rehearsing something he had told many others before. I think you may be at the wrong gate. The words hung there, suspended between them like an uninvited guest. Maya's fingers curled around the handle of her suitcase. She held her ground, meeting his gaze with a calmness that had taken years to build. I know it is. Captain Mason's lips twitched, a smirk barely restrained. Ma'am, this flight isn't for commercial passengers. It's for Harper Global's executives. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her voice measured. I'm aware. There it was. The unspoken thing. The assumption. The unasked question that hung at the edge of his smirk. And who exactly do you think you are? Before she could speak again, a voice called from behind. Is there a problem here? A flight attendant, Lily Carter, approached with a clipboard pressed tightly to her chest. Her eyes darted between Maya and Captain Mason. Just a misunderstanding, Mason replied. She thinks she's on this flight. The words cut in their simplicity, honed by the casual nature of their delivery. Maya's presence here was not an error in paperwork or scheduling but in perception. She could almost hear the unspoken part. Women like you don't own jets like this. Lily hesitated. Ma'am, do you have your confirmation? Maya retrieved her phone, displaying the email without a word. Lily's eyes scanned the screen, her lips parting slightly as the realization set in. Everything seems to be in order, Lily murmured. Mason's face hardened. Maya took a step forward. If you're done questioning whether I belong here, I'd like to board my jet now. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of the truth pressed down upon them all. Heavy and undeniable. Maya ascended the steps to the aircraft. But even as the cabin doors closed behind her, she knew the confrontation was far from over. It was never just about the flight. It never was. In America, the battles were often subtle. A smirk here, a misplaced doubt there, but every smirk, every doubt, was a reminder that belonging was something she had to fight for. Even when the deed was already in her name. The jet's cabin was quiet. But not peaceful. Silence can hold many things. And in that stillness, Maya Blake felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on her like the hum of the engines beneath her feet. She settled into the leather seat by the window. But even here, in the space she had paid for, there was no mistaking the atmosphere. From the corner of her eye, she caught the brief, hurried glances exchanged between the crew. Captain Mason's heavy steps echoed as he crossed the threshold, his presence a shadow that lingered too long. Lily Carter followed, the clipboard now more of a shield than a tool. Her eyes fixed anywhere but on Maya. Would you like anything before takeoff? Ma'am? Lily's voice was polite, yet hollow, a performance rehearsed for someone else. Maya folded her hands in her lap, her gaze unwavering. No, thank you. But the question wasn't really about drinks or comfort. It was about acknowledgement, about how much longer they could pretend not to see her. As if by ignoring her presence, they might convince themselves she didn't belong. Captain Mason's voice broke the quiet. I'm going to speak to the ground crew. Won't be long. He left without waiting for her response. Maya watched as he descended the steps, pausing on the tarmac to speak with someone just beyond the window's frame. His gestures were stiff, the conversation animated in a way that spoke more to frustration than logistics. She didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. There's been a mistake. Are you sure she's supposed to be here? Maya's chest tightened, not with anger, but with the familiar ache of something she had learned to carry. Like a stone tucked into her pocket since childhood. It was the same ache she felt when shopkeepers watched her hands too closely as she browsed. The same ache when strangers clutched their purses a little tighter as she walked by. She thought she had risen above it. But the truth was simpler. No one ever really rises above what they are forced to live beneath. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines vibrate through her skin. Let them wrestle with it. She thought, I have nothing to prove. Yet the moment did not pass. A few minutes later, Mason returned, stepping onto the jet with a carefully measured expression. But the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. Ma'am, he began, his voice low. I need to confirm one more thing before we depart. Maya's eyes met his, calm but unyielding. Confirm what exactly? He hesitated. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but sharp. Let me guess. You're wondering if I'm Maya Blake who owns this jet. Or if I borrowed someone else's name. The pause stretched long enough to hold the truth between them. Mason cleared his throat, shifting his weight. It's standard protocol. Maya tilted her head, studying him like a specimen under glass. No, it isn't. And there it was. That thin, fragile barrier between what could be said and what must remain unspoken. Lily hovered in the background, gripping her clipboard as if it might dissolve in her hands. Maya turned toward her instead. Tell me, Lily, did you question the last man who boarded this plane the way you're questioning me now? Lily's eyes flickered toward Mason, searching for direction, but Mason said nothing. I thought not, Maya said. Mason's lips pressed into a thin line. I apologize if, quote, I'm not looking for apologies. Maya interrupted. Her voice was low, but it filled the cabin like rolling thunder. I'm looking for accountability. Mason stood straighter, the color rising in his cheeks. For a moment, Maya wondered if he would lash out. If the weight of his discomfort would shift to blame. As it so often did. But instead, he nodded stiffly and turned toward the cockpit without another word. Lily lingered. Maya could feel the younger woman's hesitation. As if there was something left to say. But fear held it behind her teeth. Ma'am? Lily's voice faltered. Maya lifted a brow. Waiting. Lily began. But the words slipped away. Unfinished. Maya let the silence hang. She understood what Lily wanted to say but couldn't. I'm sorry. Perhaps. Or maybe. I didn't know. But knowing was never the problem. Maya's gaze softened, but only slightly. Next time, she said quietly. Speak before you hesitate. Lily nodded quickly, stepping away as if released from a weight she had only just begun to carry. As the engines roared to life, Maya looked out over the tarmac, watching the landscape shrink as the jet lifted into the sky. Some burdens stayed grounded, but others followed you into the clouds. Maya leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes against the golden light that streamed through the window. It was a long flight to Chicago. And somewhere, far below, the world spun on, unchanged, but not unnoticed. The sky beyond the window stretched vast and indifferent. But inside the jet, the air hung thick, too dense for the altitude they were cruising at. Silence had a weight to it, one that pressed harder with every passing mile. Maya Blake's eyes followed the clouds, though her mind lingered elsewhere. The world outside had no memory, no judgment. It simply was. But here, in this carefully upholstered cabin, every glance, every clipped word carried the residue of something older than the flight plan. Lily Carter moved about the cabin, performing tasks with a mechanical grace. She poured water into crystal glasses with hands that trembled only slightly. Captain Mason remained in the cockpit, but his presence felt like a hand resting lightly on Maya's shoulder. Just enough to remind her it was still there. Maya had lived long enough to recognize that silence was never empty. It was full, brimming with the things people refused to say. Would you like a blanket, ma'am? Lily's voice broke the stillness, but it felt more like a temporary truce than a gesture of comfort. Maya shook her head gently. I'm fine, thank you. But Maya wasn't fine, and the more she thought about it, the more she wondered if she should be. For years, she had allowed moments like these to slip by, telling herself that the work she did, the meetings, the mergers, the hours spent building something from nothing, was the answer. That success, if wielded with enough grace, might be enough to bridge the space between herself and those who measured her worth in quiet distrust. But grace was a dangerous thing. It made room for the world's excuses. It allowed people to tell themselves that the problem was invisible because the person bearing it never raised their voice. Maya glanced at Lily, who carefully avoided her gaze as she rearranged the fruit platter for the second time. Lily, Maya said softly. Lily paused, her hand hovering over the glass bowl. Yes, ma'am? Maya's voice did not rise, but it cut through the cabin like the edge of a blade. Why were you so sure I wasn't supposed to be here? Lily froze, caught in the narrow space between the truth and the version of it she wished existed. I wasn't sure, Lily stammered, the color rising in her cheeks. I was just following protocol. Maya tilted her head slightly, folding her hands in her lap. Protocol, she repeated, letting the word linger between them. The silence returned, heavier now. Lily's grip tightened around the edge of the serving cart, her knuckles pale. It wasn't personal, Lily whispered finally, as if that might soften the edges of what had already been done. Maya leaned forward, her gaze unrelenting. I know it wasn't. That's the part you should be most concerned about. Lily blinked, her lips parting slightly, but no words followed. Maya exhaled slowly, leaning back against the leather seat. She watched Lily wrestle with it, the way people do when they're forced to confront the small betrayals they commit without thinking. The truth was, Maya had no interest in punishing Lily. Lily was not the architect of this design. She was simply moving within its framework, painting within the lines she had been taught not to cross. But the lesson, Maya knew, had to be learned. After a long moment, Lily straightened, pressing her hands flat against the cart to steady herself. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said softly, this time with more weight behind the words. Maya nodded, but her gaze didn't soften. It's not me you should apologize to, Lily. It's the next woman who doesn't have the benefit of owning this jet. Lily's eyes flickered with something Maya couldn't quite name. Shame, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. I'll remember that, Lily said quietly, and this time, Maya believed her. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy calm. The glass that separated the cabin from the cockpit remained closed, and Maya could almost feel Captain Mason's gaze lingering just beyond it. As they began their descent into Chicago, Lily returned once more, her composure more measured but her eyes softer. Thank you for your patience, Lily said, carefully folding her hands in front of her. Maya met her gaze with a quiet nod. But patience, Maya thought as the jet touched down, was not the virtue they thought it was. It was a mask, one that she was growing tired of wearing. The descent into Chicago was smooth, but the tension in the cabin remained jagged. Like the first low rumble of thunder before a storm breaks. Maya Blake sat upright, her hands resting lightly on the arms of the leather seat, though her fingers betrayed her stillness. Tapping, slowly, against the polished wood, Lily Carter reappeared, this time without the veneer of professionalism she had clung to so tightly earlier. There was something more human in her now, less rehearsed. Captain Mason would like to speak with you before you disembark, Lily said, eyes flickering toward the cockpit as if his shadow still stretched over her. Maya didn't answer right away. She let the request hang there, examining it like one might a piece of fruit for bruises. There was no doubt in her mind what the conversation would entail. An apology, wrapped in explanations and tied with the bow of misunderstanding. Tell Captain Mason, Maya said after a moment, that I'll meet him on the tarmac. Lily hesitated as if searching for the right response. But finding none, she nodded and slipped away. The engines quieted, the door opened with a hydraulic sigh, and a stairway extended to meet the runway below. The sky was pale, overcast, the wind carrying the chill of early spring. Maya stepped out into it, the cool air a stark contrast to the heat simmering low in her chest. Captain Mason waited at the bottom of the stairs, his hat tucked beneath one arm, his mouth set in a thin, taut line. He stood like a man unaccustomed to explaining himself. But today, Maya knew, was not a day for habit. Dr. Blake, he began as soon as her heels touched the tarmac. His voice clipped but polished, like someone delivering a eulogy they didn't quite believe. I wanted to address any misunderstanding that may have occurred before the flight. Maya's eyes narrowed just slightly. Misunderstanding. The word rolled over her, soft and slick, designed to fit neatly over the jagged edges of what had really happened. I wasn't aware that my presence required clarification, Maya said, her voice calm but taut with the weight of withheld fury. Mason shifted, adjusting the hat beneath his arm. It wasn't about you personally, ma'am. We have certain protocols. Quote. Maya cut him off with a small, deliberate tilt of her head. Captain Mason, if there had been a man in my place, a man who looked the part, would those protocols have required the same level of scrutiny? Mason hesitated. It was a small thing, the kind of pause most people wouldn't notice. But Maya caught it as easily as she might catch the scent of rain before it fell. That's not what this was about, he said finally, though the words lacked conviction. Maya stepped closer, until the space between them was narrow enough that Mason had no choice but to meet her gaze. Isn't it? She asked softly, the question curling like smoke in the air between them. He blinked, caught for a moment in the gravity of her stare. There's something you need to understand, Captain, Maya continued, her voice low but firm. I've spent my entire life in rooms full of people who didn't believe I belonged there. And every time, every single time, they've called it a misunderstanding. Mason's jaw tightened, but Maya wasn't done. I built this company from the ground up. I own this jet. I don't have the luxury of misunderstanding people. I know exactly what I saw in your eyes the moment I stepped onto that runway. Mason's gaze flickered, darting away for the briefest of seconds before settling back on her face. There was no anger in Maya's voice. No theatrics. Just the weight of years stacked carefully behind her words. The slow accumulation of moments that had finally begun to spill over. You judged me, Maya said quietly, before I ever said a word. And the truth is, you wouldn't have questioned whether I belonged here if you hadn't already decided that I didn't. The wind swept through the empty space between them, carrying the last of her words into the broad expanse of the runway. Mason swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he tried to assemble a response from the broken pieces of his pride. But nothing came, and that, Maya thought, was enough. She didn't wait for him to apologize. She didn't need to hear it. There are some apologies so worn out they no longer fit the shape of the offense. Instead, Maya stepped past him, the sound of her heels striking the tarmac sharp and steady. By the time she reached the waiting car, Lily had already loaded her luggage. As Maya climbed inside, she caught Lily's eye through the rearview mirror. Lily didn't look away this time. For a fleeting moment, Maya saw something in her. A crack in the surface. Small but deep enough to let the light in. And maybe, Maya thought as the car pulled away. That's how change begins. Not with the storm, but with the silence that follows it. Maya sat in her office. The soft hum of the city filtering in through the windows. But there was no peace in the stillness. The weight of the events at the terminal hadn't left her. And it lingered now like a shadow in every corner of the room. The office, once a sanctuary where she crafted business strategies and made decisions that spanned continents, felt small today, too small for the truth she had just uncovered. Her phone buzzed, the vibrating echo against the desk snapping her back to reality. It was a text from her assistant. Sarah, we've received a complaint from the terminal manager about your conversation with Captain Mason. He's asking for a formal statement. A formal statement. The words were a subtle reminder of the game she had no interest in playing. But Maya had learned long ago that no matter how successful you become, no matter how much power you wield, there were always rules in place to remind you who was truly in charge. And they were never the ones who looked like her. She leaned back in her chair, letting the tension in her neck rise before exhaling sharply. Maya had built Harper Global on her own terms. She'd navigated deals, fostered partnerships, and met every challenge head-on. But this was different. This was a reckoning, and the truth of it had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Her eyes drifted to the window once more, watching the traffic below, a silent river of movement. Each car, each face, a part of the larger machine that seemed to function without ever questioning its own mechanisms. How many people, she wondered, had been dismissed like this? How many others had walked through those same gates, with the same judgment in their eyes, and had simply been too afraid to speak up? It was one thing to be judged by someone like Captain Mason. Someone who had no interest in seeing her for what she truly was. But Maya knew it was another thing altogether to allow such behavior to persist in the shadows. To let the small betrayals pile up until they formed something much larger and far more dangerous. The door to her office opened, and Sarah stepped in with her usual efficiency. But today, there was something different in the way she held herself. Less the confident assistant and more the messenger of inevitable bad news. Maya, Sarah began, I spoke with Roland, the terminal manager. He's furious. He says your confrontation with the crew is creating waves. And it's already affecting relations with some of the high-profile clients. They don't understand why you had to make it so public. Maya didn't flinch. They don't understand, she repeated, her voice quiet but carrying a sting. No, Sarah continued, they're questioning your approach. They think it could damage the company's reputation. They're saying this isn't the kind of thing we do. Maya let the words sink in. But she wasn't surprised. This was the cost of defiance. The price you paid for forcing people to confront their own discomfort. You're going to have to address it, Sarah said, her tone softer now. I think it's best to send a statement. Something official. And maybe, quote, maybe what? Maya cut in. Maybe I should apologize for holding them accountable? For making them confront their bias? Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting away, then meeting Maya's gaze. It's not about that. It's about how this looks to the people we're working with. They don't want drama. They want results. Maya stood up, pacing slowly across the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. I didn't create drama, Sarah, she said, her voice low and steady, but full of something far sharper than frustration. What happened at the terminal wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of something much deeper. A system that's built on assumptions and biases. And if we don't address that head-on, we're complicit in it. Sarah remained quiet, watching her closely. You think I'm overreacting, don't you? Maya asked, turning to face her assistant. No, I don't think that, Sarah replied, her voice measured but still laced with uncertainty. But the question is, what happens next? How do we move forward from this? Maya stopped pacing, her hands clasped tightly together. We move forward by doing what we've always done. By setting a new standard. And if they don't like it, then they're not the ones I want in this company. There was a brief silence between them. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else. A moment of clarity, of understanding. "I'll draft the statement," Sarah said, though her voice had a new weight to it. Maya nodded. "Good. And make sure it doesn't say a word about me. This isn't about me. This is about the people we're supposed to be serving. The people who don't have a private jet or a name that demands respect." As Sarah turned to leave, Maya returned to her desk. The weight of her decision settling firmly on her shoulders. Outside the window, the world churned on, as it always did. The streets below were as crowded as ever. The hum of activity relentless. Like the machine that never stopped. But in this moment, Maya had made a choice. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been invisible in the eyes of the world. She picked up the phone, dialing the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice, and then, "Darnell." "Maya." Her brother's voice came through the line. Steady and warm. "What's going on?" "I need you to do something for me," Maya said, her voice resolute. "We need to make a bigger impact than this. I'm going to make sure people understand the reality of bias. And I'm going to show them what happens when you call it out." "Good," Darnell replied without missing a beat. "Let me know what you need. And we'll get it done." Maya smiled faintly, the quiet sense of peace that followed her brother's words a welcome relief. She had made her mark. And there was no turning back now. No more silence. No more pretending it wasn't happening. It was time to take the next step. And this time, the world would be watching. The summit was scheduled for a few weeks out. But already the pressure was mounting. Maya Blake could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Rising. Heavy. A storm brewing that she couldn't ignore. What she had begun as a small act of defiance at the private terminal had ballooned into something much larger than she anticipated. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the uncomfortable truths that people avoided at all costs. About the biases that took root before anyone ever had the chance to speak. In the weeks since the incident, Maya had heard the murmurs, the whispers in the boardrooms, the slow-moving rumblings of discomfort. People didn't like being challenged, especially when their assumptions were exposed. They didn't like being forced to confront the quiet prejudices that shaped their decisions. From who got the job to who got the corner office. It was one thing to be kind, polite even, but kindness alone never moved the needle of change. What Maya had done, what she was still doing, was far more dangerous. She was holding up a mirror to the very heart of their complicity. She sat at her desk, reviewing the agenda for the summit. The event was meant to be a turning point, a moment to amplify voices that had been pushed to the margins. Yet as Maya scanned through the list of attendees, corporate leaders, activists, and politicians, the quiet realization struck her. Even here, even among those who called themselves allies, the same biases lingered. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email from her legal team. There are concerns about the public fallout from the terminal incident. Some of the major sponsors want reassurances that this won't negatively impact their brands. Maya leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. Reassurances. They wanted her to apologize. To make it disappear. To sweep the uncomfortable truths back under the rug where they had always belonged. But Maya was done with pretending. Pretending that her skin didn't make her a target. Pretending that her success hadn't been harder won because of the weight of history she carried on her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the silence fill the space around her. She had built Harper Global from nothing, fought for every inch of it. But now, the real battle was just beginning. The tension in the office was palpable, and Maya could feel it settling like a storm cloud in the air. She knew she had to act. To move beyond the comfortable language of corporate niceties. To speak the truth that was often left unspoken. She wasn't interested in apologies, she was interested in accountability. As the days passed, Maya's resolve only strengthened. She prepared for the summit with meticulous care, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. The summit wasn't just a corporate event, it was a statement. A challenge. A direct confrontation with the entrenched biases that dictated who mattered and who didn't. On the day of the summit, the atmosphere in the ballroom was electric with anticipation. There were hundreds of people in the room, all dressed in the crisp suits of the corporate elite, the polished shoes of the powerful, and the carefully curated smiles of those who had made it, who had arrived. But Maya could see it. The subtle way their eyes slid over her. The unspoken assumption that she had somehow snuck in. That she was not one of them. She stood at the podium, her presence filling the room before she even opened her mouth. The silence settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. People were waiting for her to say something they could neatly package and dismiss. They were waiting for her to apologize. They were waiting for her to give them permission to return to their comfort zones. But Maya didn't speak immediately. She stood there, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, allowing them to feel the weight of her silence. In that moment, she wasn't just a businesswoman, she was something more. Something they had never expected. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. A quiet force that commanded attention. This summit, Maya began, her words deliberate and clear, is not about me. It's not about Harper Global. It's about every person who has been overlooked, disregarded, and diminished simply because they didn't fit the mold. She paused, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. Too often, she continued, we talk about diversity and inclusion as if it's something we can add to the equation. But the truth is, diversity is not an addition. It is a necessity. We don't need to ask for a seat at the table. We need to redefine the table itself. The room stirred, uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. This wasn't what they had expected. They weren't here to be told how much their efforts had failed. They were here to feel good about their commitment to change without actually confronting what change would look like. Maya's eyes locked on a few familiar faces in the crowd. Faces of people who had long made their peace with the world as it was. But this world, she knew, was a lie they all carried with them like a well-worn coat. I spent years in boardrooms. In meetings where I had to prove my worth over and over again. Where I had to justify my existence with numbers. With results. With everything except who I am. Maya continued, her voice rising now, the fire behind it unmistakable. And I am done pretending. I am done letting people like you determine whether or not I belong here. Because I don't need to be accepted by a system that wasn't made for me. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some sat back, their discomfort palpable. Others shifted forward, intrigued by the rawness in her words. But Maya knew one thing for certain. They would not be able to unhear her. She continued, each word deliberate, building with intensity. And if we're serious about change, if we're serious about confronting systemic bias, we have to stop pretending that progress is a nice little package we can give ourselves. Progress is uncomfortable. It requires us to dismantle what we've built, what we've relied on. It requires us to ask questions that don't have easy answers, and to listen to voices that have been silenced for far too long. The murmurs grew louder, more strained. Maya could see the subtle shaking of heads, the discomfort etched in every face. But she held her ground. She didn't look away. She wouldn't let them. Diversity is not a trend, she said, her words cutting through the noise. It is a responsibility, and it is the future, whether you're ready for it or not. And just like that, the room fell silent. The truth had been laid bare, not as an accusation, but as a call to action. Maya stood at the center of it all, her words hanging heavy in the air. She had said it, she had exposed the lie. And now, there was no turning back. This wasn't just a moment of reckoning. It was the beginning of something new. The days following the summit were a blur of meetings, press inquiries, and reports that piled up like a mountain Maya had no interest in climbing. But there was something beneath the surface. A crack in the foundation of everything she had known. The true weight of the battle had yet to fully hit her. The summit had been a spark. A moment of defiance that left people whispering in its wake. But Maya knew that sparks didn't start fires. It was what you did after the flame appeared that determined whether it would burn out or rage on. The phone calls started coming in. Some of them were congratulatory. Others less so. She had expected this. The fallout from disturbing the delicate balance of things. But what truly struck her was the absence of any real reflection. Any movement toward change. She had given them a moment. A chance to listen. To confront the ugliness that festered in every corner of society. But their response, she could feel, was a steady retreat back into comfort. And that, Maya knew, was the real battle. The ones who would pretend to hear her, but not actually listen. That was the danger. They would smile and nod, offer a few token gestures of change, and then quietly return to the status quo. Her reflection was broken by the sound of her assistant, Sarah, entering the office. Sarah's face was tight, her posture a little more rigid than usual. Maya, Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. There's a call from Roland, the terminal manager. He's upset about your comments at the summit. He says the clients are starting to question their partnerships with Harper Global. Maya's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond immediately. Roland's phone call wasn't unexpected. She had known this moment would come. The discomfort, the unease, they were inevitable. Tell him I'll take the call, Maya said, her voice steady, but inside, her thoughts were a whirlwind. Roland was a man who lived in the gray areas, who liked to smooth over the rough edges of uncomfortable truths. And now, after the summit, he was worried about how those truths might disrupt the polished world he inhabited. As the phone rang, Maya stared out the window, watching the people below move as if nothing had changed, as if the world didn't need to be re-examined, as if the patterns of oppression and inequality weren't etched into the fabric of daily life, visible to anyone willing to look. Miss Blake, Roland's voice came through, smooth but tight, as if he were swallowing his words. I hope you're well. I wanted to discuss the aftermath of the summit. We're receiving significant pushback from some of our long-standing clients. They feel the conversation has been too confrontational. Maya didn't hesitate. Confrontational? Roland, the truth is confrontational. Do you really expect me to sugarcoat it? You want me to speak in platitudes? To make people comfortable with the way things are? Roland cleared his throat. No, of course not. But we need to be careful. You know how the world works. Change has to come in increments. Too much at once, it's overwhelming. Overwhelming, Maya repeated, her voice cool. Is that what we're calling it now? Overwhelming? It's uncomfortable. Roland, that's the point. If people are uncomfortable, then maybe, just maybe, it means they're finally being asked to confront something real. There was a long pause on the other end. I'm just saying, Roland continued, his voice lower now, that you need to be strategic. This kind of change takes time. You can't push people too hard. Maya's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. Strategic. That was the word. It was the language of those who never had to live with the burden of inequality. It was the language of those who never had to fight for every step forward, to prove that they deserved the space they occupied. Roland, she said, her voice a little sharper now. I didn't start this company by waiting for permission. I didn't get here by following the rules of comfort. And I'm not going to sit back and let people who profit off of inequality tell me what's strategic. The line was silent for a beat. I understand, Maya, Roland finally said, his voice softening, but you're pushing a lot of people out of their comfort zones. I don't know if they'll ever come back. Then let them leave, Maya said, the words clear and final. If they can't handle the truth, then they were never really on our side to begin with. She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the window again, watching the lives below move forward as if nothing had shifted. The world didn't stop, didn't slow down. The machinery kept turning, but in her heart, something had been irrevocably altered. Maya knew she was no longer just a woman fighting for success in a business world that had never been built for her. She was something more now. Something more dangerous. And as she stood up from her desk, her resolve hardening like steel, she knew one thing for certain: the real fight was just beginning. There would be no turning back now. The phone call with Roland was a small skirmish in the larger war Maya was fighting. But it revealed something undeniable. The world, as it was, wasn't just complacent. It was actively resistant to change. People would sit in their offices, behind their polished desks, surrounded by the trappings of their power, and they would talk about change, but only on their terms. They would speak of progress in the abstract, never acknowledging the ways in which their own systems of privilege and power stood in the way. But Maya wasn't going to let them forget. She wasn't going to let them hide behind their comfortable lies anymore. She had seen the truth for what it was, and now it was her responsibility to make sure everyone else did too. Maya walked out of her office, stepping into the hallway with a sense of purpose. There were no more negotiations. No more waiting for approval. The world would have to change, or it would burn under the weight of its own refusal. And for the first time in her life, Maya understood just how powerful she had become. The city sprawled beneath her, bathed in the soft glow of dusk. Maya stood by the window in her office, watching the streets below, those lifeless veins of the city, filled with motion but empty of meaning. The world moved on, as it always did, undisturbed by the weight of the things people refused to see. She had been fighting a battle no one else seemed to notice. Until now, the summit had done what she hoped it would. It had shaken the ground beneath the feet of the powerful, forcing them to confront the truths they'd long buried beneath layers of politeness and pretension. But as the echoes of that confrontation faded, something else became clear. Even when the truth is spoken, there are those who will twist it, bury it, and push it back into the shadows, as if their comfort matters more than the lives of the people they trample to maintain it. But the world was no longer the same. She could feel it in her bones. The tension that had settled in the air. There were murmurs now, quiet whispers of the change she had begun. People were uncomfortable, unwilling to face what had been laid bare before them. Maya knew that discomfort, though. She had known it all her life. It was the discomfort of living in a world that constantly made you justify your existence. Your right to take up space. Your right to demand dignity. She took a deep breath and turned away from the window. The fight had only just begun. But now, the real challenge was before her. Her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. Maya. The voice on the other end was familiar but strained. It was Roland, the terminal manager. The same Roland who had been so eager to smooth things over with her. To keep the quiet discomfort of the powerful undisturbed. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice clipped. Things are getting worse. The clients are pulling out. There's talk of boycotts. They're calling it divisive. And it's spreading fast. The press is picking it up now. It's out of control. Maya's chest tightened, but she refused to let the fear show. Is that so? I was under the impression that we were moving towards something better. Roland, that's what we said, wasn't it? That's what we promised the people who needed to hear it the most. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind of pause that revealed more than the words that followed. You have to understand, Maya, Roland continued, this isn't just about you. You're talking about systems, about real change. People are scared, people with power. People who've built their whole lives on those systems don't know how to react when someone comes in and knocks it all over. Scared? Maya repeated, her voice soft but carrying the weight of years. I've been scared my entire life. Roland, every day. You think I don't know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like I don't belong there? You think I haven't seen those looks? The ones that tell you that no matter what you achieve, you're still other, still not quite enough? She let the silence hang between them, her voice thick with everything she had been forced to endure. What do you want from me, Roland? She asked, her voice now steady, sharp as glass. You want me to apologize? To take back everything I said and give people their nice, comfortable lie back? To pretend like the problem doesn't exist? That the biases are just mistakes? That the world can keep turning without facing what's wrong with it? Another silence. It stretched long, thick with the tension neither of them was willing to ignore anymore. I'm not asking you to apologize, Roland finally said. I'm asking you to think about the cost. Your cost. This kind of change, it's not free. Maya, people aren't going to just accept it and move on. There's a price to be paid. You know that. I'm telling you, this is bigger than you think. You're asking people to change something they've lived with for generations. And when they're forced to change, well, you know what happens. Things break. Maya leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. Things are broken already. Roland, that's the point. You think this was about just one incident? About my confrontation at the terminal? No. It's about a system that's been built on brokenness for so long that we've all forgotten it's even cracked. But I'm not going to pretend that everything's fine just so that the rich can sleep at night. The words hung between them like a thick fog. And for the first time in the conversation, Maya felt a strange calm settle over her. She understood now. Roland's fear wasn't about the clients. It was about himself. About his place in the world. He didn't want to change because change would mean confronting everything he had come to accept as fact. The belief that his comfort, his peace, was worth more than the struggle of others. Maya exhaled slowly. If this is the price I have to pay for change, Roland, then I will gladly pay it. But let me be clear. I'm not the one who's been living a lie. I'm not the one who needs to be comfortable. The conversation ended with the soft click of the receiver. But Maya wasn't listening anymore. She was standing now, walking toward the window again. She looked out over the city. Her city, where everything was still the same. Yet nothing would ever be the same again. For a long time, Maya had felt like an outsider. She had felt like the world had forced her into a box. Made her conform to rules that never had her in mind. But now, in this moment, with the world watching her and the weight of history pressing down on her, she understood something profound. The world wasn't going to change on its own. The systems weren't going to crumble just because she asked them to. Change would come, but it would come through the relentless, unyielding force of truth. And truth wasn't always pretty. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always comfortable. But it was necessary. She thought of the faces in the room at the summit. The people who had sat uncomfortably in their seats as she spoke. She thought of the people who had been forced to stand up for their dignity. Who had seen their hopes dismissed simply because of the color of their skin. Because of the names they carried. Because of where they came from. They had been waiting for someone to speak for them. And now, Maya has become that voice. The cost was high, but Maya was ready. She had always been ready. And so, she would stand, she would fight, and she would not stop until the world, this world, was unrecognizable to those who had made it so. Because there was nothing more dangerous than the truth that could no longer be denied.